institutions around the country, I believe.
Yes, thank you. Yes, I'm speaking at different events, just trying to raise awareness of the book and its significance, as you said.
Mashallah, it's great. Now, this book, which you've published recently, titled Sufi Salafis and Islamist Contested Ground for British Islamic Activism, could you give us some insight into why you selected this title and what exactly do you mean by Islamic activism?
Yes, well, the title, the key words there, those three terms, Sufi, Salafis, and Islamists, is deliberately phrased as such. One, first of all, to describe a particular type of religious practice, but also because the latter two terms are very sensitive and often used in the public sphere in a mostly negative way. So, Islamist in the last 10 years or so has acquired a very negative meaning in it. People automatically make associations with things like extremism, terrorism, religious radicalization, and obviously we know in the current political environment, it's a term that nobody really wants to be associated with.
No.
And similarly with Salafi or Salafism, it's often interchanged with the term Wahhabism. And again, that's had a lot of media currency in recent years. And again, it describes a certain kind of Islam which nobody really wants to own up to. So the book really, for me, and also Sufism has just come into the to public attention again the last week or so with the terrible tragedy in Egypt.
Yeah.
So for me, these aren't new terms in a sense. I must clarify, because usually the first question people ask me is, why are you using those words for? Well, first of all, they are academic terms in common usage, and there's no real kind of controversy there. They've been around for decades as a shorthand to describe different types of religious practice and understanding, and that's the thing. It's just a way of organizing language, and as I say, in a sense, the terms have been hijacked, and it's a negative association which people feel uncomfortable with. But for me, it was trying, first and foremost, this book came out of my own PhD research, which I started about 10 years ago.
Yeah.
For me, first, I was trying to actually make sense of the religious landscape in the UK, of having been active myself in different kinds of voluntary work, since the late 80s, really. But the 1990s were the kind of defining generation for people who were born in or brought up in Britain in the 1970s and 80s. And so my first argument in the book is that generation and those people involved with those three types of religious paradigm shaped the kinds of Islam, the public Islam, the private Islam, which we are now living today and we're witnessing today. So it's relevant because it's not that only it was something from 20 years ago, but it has shaped and defined where we are today when we talk about Islam. And I think it's really important to try to understand that, because I've just about, I think, figured it out myself. But there's Muslim audiences who I think would be interested in trying to make sense of it, because again, there have been some Muslims from within our communities who have come up and written books in the last few years that have actually misinterpreted these issues and, in a sense, have politicized them and clearly allied with government narratives and helped to define government narratives around the ways in which Muslims organize and express themselves. So there's a political dimension to it, which I think wider non-Muslims need to be aware of. And I wrote it with non-Muslim audiences in mind as well.
Okay, that's interesting. And what's the reaction been from people that may have given their feedback from a non-Muslim perspective? I'm just interested in that angle.
Yes, well, I'm very fortunate in that I've had a lot of positive feedback from academics, fellow academics who obviously know the subject area.
Yeah.
Because it's helped to deepen their understanding of what is going on. Because there's actually not that many books that have looked in detail at the different religious trends. I mean, there have been, 2, 3 quite good books that have looked at one or two of the trends, but I've kind of done that kind of panoramic analysis, if you like.
Yeah.
And so try to put a whole story together. So that's been good. I've had very good feedback from people in the media. People are at this moment reading it, and they will be reviewing it in some of the mainstream newspapers. And I've had some good feedback from politicians and policymakers as well, who are interested in wanting to come and speak about it.
And do you foresee the book? I mean, one would hope, but do you see the book having some sort of influence on those that make policy? Do you think it could have a positive influence on future policies?
Well, I mean, I think it would be. My intention here is not necessarily to influence policy in that concrete way, I guess, because that's not really my position and intention. But I guess, in some ways, yes. I'd like people to be better informed, and that was my main intention, really. And if people after reading this, feel better informed and understand what is going on in our communities and the huge complexities in a better informed way, in a way that's based on evidence and rigor and not a particular political agenda, because I don't have a political agenda. I'm I'm an academic. I'm interested in presenting facts. I think that's something of value, and I think there's a lot of misinformation out there. So, if I give you a concrete example, the terms Islamism and Salafism at the moment are kind of really hot buzzwords. I mean, they just really press the buttons for people inside and outside our community. So we're kind of like sick to death of saying those words, because it's a put down. To be called an Islamist is to be called a put down. And
Absolutely.
when people call you an Islamist, is any Muslim that is basically raises the head above the parapet and disagrees with government policy or is critical of government foreign policy, you're at risk of being labelled an Islamist, whether you are or not personally sympathetic to that particular strand of Islamic thinking. And so it's really important to distinguish language, and that's what I think is important here. And I think I hope policymakers and people in the media take note of this, because I'm not the first person to say this.
No.
So it's correcting that kind of sloppy, careless throwing around of terms.
Yeah.
And hopefully, if it helps them to understand, the communities that we live in a way which increases nuance, I guess.
Okay.
And it's not about goodies and baddies, because there are one or two books out there that clearly are basically telling you, well, look, that Muslim community and that Muslim organization is problematic, and watch out for them.
Yeah.
These groups are extremist, and those Muslims we can work with. I mean, I'm trying to challenge all that and say actually it's a lot more complicated.
Yeah. No, that's interesting. And you've touched upon one of your objectives of the book, which is trying to get people to be more informed about the different Muslim communities in the UK. Was that your inspiration to write this book? Was that your key objective? What exactly are you trying to achieve? Can you elaborate a bit further on that?
Sure. So as I was saying, there's a couple of reasons I wrote the book. First of all, I always had an interest in it. I've been involved in Islamic activism myself, and I think it's important for Muslims to represent themselves first and foremost. I mean, people are writing about us, people are speaking about us, people are representing us who are not from the Muslim communities. And I think, we can do that very well for ourselves. 10, 15, 20 years ago, there were very few Muslim academics who were writing and speaking in public. But that's changed now, right? We have second and third generations who are very talented, and people who work in the media, people like yourselves. We've got access to our own resources, and we are developing institutions. But still, there is a kind of a tilt towards outsiders talking about Muslims you know. I think we can speak for ourselves. So that's one thing.
Yeah.
It's important to be able to articulate our own narratives, and my book is just one narrative, and it's not the end, it's not the finished say on this subject area, but, you know, it's an invitation, an introduction, and if anybody else wants to zoom in and write more about a particular community that I've covered, fine. But for me, it is about increasing public religious literacy, both within Muslim communities and outside Muslim communities. And as I say, if it has a positive influence in perhaps providing a balanced public social policy, well, that's a bonus.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Okay, Jazakallah, Brother Sadiq. It's Faisal here. Question for you. We can see people identify themselves as Sufis, Brelwis, Tabligis and Salafis, etc. But me personally, I've not come across anyone who identifies themselves as an Islamist. I mean, as you've mentioned, it's something that they probably find offensive and they don't want to be associated. Sure. I've not had a chance to read your book yet, I must say. But according to your research and your experience, what kind of groups, organizations fall into that category of Islamist?
Sure. Well, Islamist is a term that, I mean, that's some of the feedback I've been getting from speaking to Islamic organizations and Muslim communities, is that some people do call themselves Sufis, some people call themselves Salafis, but nobody calls themselves Islamists. Well, the thing is, that's only a recent phenomena, actually, and that's only because since 2005, really, the pressure on politically orientated Islamic organizations has been very intense and increasingly so, to discredit them and to link them with extremist organizations. So, basically, in simple terms, Islamism is interchanged with the term political Islam. Okay, and in the UK, we do have many organizations that are, if you like, their heritage, their intellectual and spiritual lineage falls within the political Islamist groups that came in the 1960s, as did the other traditions, right, with the settler generations of the 1960s. Okay, so these religious paradigms that I've talked about, Sufi, Salafis, Islamists, they're global paradigms, and accordingly, they were transplanted to the UK when significant numbers of Muslims came in the 1960s. So in the UK, the people who are of that orientation, people who believe that Islam has something to say about pretty much every area of public life. Islam is not just a private religion. Islam has something to say about politics. It has something to say about economics. It has something to say about the implementation of law, governance, and so on. Those people who believe Islam has an ideological, if you like, alternative to capitalism and socialism and other man-made, quote-unquote, systems of thought, they are the ones who are considered Islamists. Now, they had no problem in describing themselves as such up until about a decade ago, and that's the thing. In this country, it would be organizations such as the Young Muslims UK, the Islamic Society of Britain in its founding phase, the Muslim Association of Britain, the Islamic Forum Europe, and the IFE, in other words, who are basically people who run the East London Mosque, and so on. And there are many other organizations that have been inspired by political Islam. They won't call themselves political Islamists today. It's like saying I'm a radicalized extremist Muslim. Do you understand? So they wouldn't own up to it publicly in that sense.
I mean, what about groups like, on the news, for example, you hear about Hizb ut-Tahrir and organizations like that. They're normally classed as Islamists. Would you say that they're in the same category as the ones you've mentioned?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. They and I think, again, I mean, it's very easy to see, even though they might not publicly admit it. I mean, they did a lot of moving around of their material after 7/7. But yeah, it's clear they are an Islamist movement, and unapologetically so. If you look at their international websites, their ideologization of Islam is very clear, and they are the most politicized of all the political movements. I mean, for them, their single focus is politics, Islamic politics, quote unquote. So yes, Hizb ut-Tahrir, and I focused, on them as one of the main groups. Today also we have other groups that are advocacy groups, campaigning groups that may not openly identify themselves as Islamists, but
sorry to cut you off. I need to stop you there because we're just coming up to a break. Sorry to stop you in full flow, but please do hold that thought because we're going to jump straight back into that. Do stay with us, listeners, please. Salaam Radio 106.2 FM, Friday Night Prime. Stay with us for more with Dr. Sadiq, inshallah.
Stay tuned to Salaam Radio after this short ad break.
Sadly, millions of orphans living in the poorest countries lack the necessary support for a healthy childhood. These children have to endure lives of hardship without the basic necessities that will help them to grow, to learn, to live. Let's show them that we do care. Let's brighten up their future. Call 0161 225 0225 or visit humanappeal.org.uk.
Do you like the idea of being a radio presenter? Have you got a great idea for a show? Why not get in touch with us? We are always looking for enthusiastic, committed and professional individuals to join our team of volunteer presenters. Send us an email to info@salamradio.co.uk and we'll be in touch. You could be on air sooner than you think.
Third world and developing countries are home to some of the most vulnerable children on the planet. Malnutrition, severe lack of medical aid and access to clean water are just some of the horrific challenges faced by orphans across Africa and Asia. Children of Adam, a Peterborough charity, need your help to bring aid to these orphans for just £25 a month. To sponsor an orphan or assist with other projects, please call 0300 321 0032 or visit www.childrenofadam.net.
Iqra Academy is the only Muslim girls' school in Cambridgeshire where your daughter will develop her knowledge of Islam and the national curriculum in a safe environment. Ofsted has judged the teaching and learning, leadership and management, pupil behaviour and personal development as good in June 2017. Iqra Academy's qualified staff teach in small classes, and the school is producing sports teams who have a track record of succeeding at national level. With reduced fees and a good rating 3 times from Ofsted, why not consider Iqra Academy for your daughter? Enroll now to avoid disappointment. Please contact 01733 331 433 or email admin@iqraacademy.org.uk.
The messenger of God, peace be upon him, said, God will say, Son of Adam, I fell ill, but you did not visit me. He will say, O Lord, and how could I have visited you? You are the Lord of the worlds. He will say, Did you not know that my so-and-so servant had fallen ill, and you did not visit him? Did you not know that had you visited him, you would have found me with him? Son of Adam, I have asked you for food, but you did not feed me. He will say, O Lord, how could I have fed you? You are the Lord of the worlds. He will say, My so-and-so servant asked you for food, and you did not feed him. Did you not know that had you fed him, you would surely have found that with me? Son of Adam, I have asked you to give me drink, but you did not give me. He will say, O Lord, how could I have given you to drink? You are the Lord of the worlds. He will say, My so-and-so servant asked you to give him drink, and you did not give him. Had you given him to drink, you would surely have found that with me.
Narrated by Abu Huraira in the collections of Muslim.
This This is Salaam Radio, Peterborough's Muslim community radio. Broadcasting on 106.2 FM and online.
Assalamu alaikum, listeners. Welcome back to Friday Night Prime here on Salaam Radio 106.2 FM. We've been talking and will continue to be talking to Dr. Sadiq Hamid. For those that have just joined us, he's a senior researcher at the Oxford Centre for Islamic Studies at the University of Oxford. And he's recently written a book, one of many, called Sufis, Salafis and Islamists. And this is a book that we're talking in and around. And we just asked him the question and we had to cut him off, unfortunately. Apologies for that, brother, having to cut you off mid-flow. Assalamu alaikum, brother. I think we've lost Dr. Okay, we're trying to get hold of him again. So I'll just introduce Dr. Sadiq again while we're just trying to get him back on air for those that may have just joined us. So he's a very accomplished brother and he's also been a lecturer in contemporary Islamic studies, religious studies, Muslims in Britain and Muslim youth work at the universities of Chester and Liverpool Hope. And he's written, as I said, many books, one of which we're discussing today, Sufis, Salafis and Islamists, the contested ground of British Islamic activism. And it's a very relevant and timely time to have the conversation. But his other books are also around British Muslims, political Muslims, young British Muslims, and youth work and Islam. So I think we've got, I think we're just about to get Dr. Sadiq back now. We have lost him. But yeah, assalamu alaikum, brother. Can you hear me?
Walaikum salam, yes. Can you hear me?
I can hear you now, yes. So we'd lost you for a second, but thanks for bearing with us during our commercial break. And sorry to have to cut you off sort of mid-flow. But you were kind of mid-flow talking about the likes of Hizb ut-Tahrir being in the same category as Islamists. So you were kind of elaborating on that thought process.
Yeah, I mean, basically, the thing is, right, with that particular category, people are reluctant to openly self-define as Islamists, but the thing is, they are clearly. If you talk to them privately, they will say yes. I had a conversation the other day when people, when people were talking about how relevant that term was. But then, I mean, we were having in the Q&A when I spoke to them later in the evening, and they were saying, well, actually, yeah, we are. But we don't want to be labelled. We don't want it to have a backlash or a kind of comeback on it, because the government has made it clear that Islamists are undesirable and problematic, and you can there are repercussions for openly stating your affiliations with a kind of outlook, a religious outlook, which is militant, which is assertive, which believes that Islam has something to say about the way societies are run in Muslim majority countries and here also, and because of obviously the baggage which we've kind of we've all kind of imposed upon us in the last decade to do with the PREVENT program, counter-terrorism, etc., etc.
Yeah. And sometimes people use the terms Islamist and jihadist interchangeably, or conservatism and radicalization. Is this correct, or is there a difference?
It's incorrect, and that's one of the reasons I wrote the book. As I said, it's important to be careful in how we use our language and how we describe different kinds of religious expression, because an easy way to understand it and way I explain it, particularly to non-Muslims, it's like a spectrum. You have two ends. You have a right and a left, and in mainstream politics, right, we have conservative and we have left wing, and in between is a centrist position. And similarly, in terms of expression of Islam, you have in political Islam, you have people who are kind of in between and moderate, and then you have people who then tend towards the extremist strand of it. And jihadists, if you look at what they're actually saying, what they're about, what they actually want to do, they only share one or two of the features of people who describe themselves as Islamists. But they are where they differ is they might kind of ultimately want the same thing, but it's the means and the methods in which they want to achieve, which really distinguishes them. So, moderate Islamists, okay, the people I've described in the book, the young Muslims, MAB, IFE, etc.
Yeah.
And even now, they would actually probably say they're not Islamists. Okay, but the thing is, It's in their publications. I mean, you have to be honest about it. You might say you're not now, but you were. I mean, it's all in the website. It's in literature. It's in the book. I've pointed out the fact that a lot of these groups are now kind of disassociating themselves. But the reality they were. I mean, we have to be honest about these things. This is the history. But the further you go to the right, the likes of Hizb ut-Tahrir, you see a bit. You see a more kind of extreme kind of positioning in the rhetoric and what they actually want to do and how they want to do it.
Yeah.
So the extreme radical, the real extremists are people who will use violence to achieve their political goals, and that's what distinguishes really the jihadists. They will basically use their terrorist tactics in the name of Islam to say this is from Islam, and it is okay to kill people, it is okay to kill civilians, it is even okay to kill fellow Muslims to achieve an Islamic society. And that's basically what's happened with Al-Qaeda and ISIS in the last 10, 15 years. So, but that's a big difference from moderate Islamists in the UK and certainly in the Middle East and other parts of the Muslim world who say, well, look, we would like to see Islam have a greater role in society, but we will work through the electoral system, and we believe that the democratic route is the best route. So there's a big difference, isn't it? But in popular kind of media conversation, and in the way many politicians talk about it, they do interchange jihadist and Islamist without even thinking about it. And that's either because they are ignorant or they do that deliberately. As a way of discrediting anybody who is politically assertive in their identity and the relationship with their religion.
Yeah, I mean, going back into that same topic again about Islamist organizations, you mentioned young Muslims, and I remember young Muslims in my teenage days.
Okay.
And also I remember HT while I was at uni.
Yes. Right.
Now, these two organizations are very different.
Yes.
I just don't know how you can categorize them in the same Islamist category.
Well, I mean, the thing is, it's not very difficult to identify similarities and also the differences. It's a matter of understanding how they themselves describe. Okay, so to understand young Muslims, you got to know something about their history, where they came from, what are their ideological inspirations, who are their scholars, what they want to achieve, and so on. How do they interpret Islam? How do they envision Islam's role in society? And when you look at young Muslims' early literature, I mean, in the founding missions and who actually set up the Young Muslims. So the Young Muslims was inspired by a scholar, Khurram Murad, who was actually one of the vice deputies of leaders of Jamaat Islami, Pakistan. Okay, that is one of the world's most well-known and influential Islamist organizations. That's not like a secret. UKIM came out of that particular kind of camp, and UKIM was the home from which Young Muslims was founded. Right now, Hizb ut-Tahrir came from a very different social context, which was Palestine in the 1950s. And if you look at the writings of its founder, Taqiyuddin Nabhani, his vision for Islam and the way he envisioned Islam's role in society, you'll see an overlap between that and the Jamaat Islami and also the Muslim Brotherhood. So you see they're part of the same family in terms of how they want to change society through Islamic teachings. So that's the thing. There are similarities and differences, but if you actually look at the characteristics, you will see the same.
Okay, excellent. Slightly changing the topic, would you say Muslim religious conservatism and radicalism appear to be on the rise in the UK, or is it simply a case of Muslims becoming more observant of their faith?
Well, it again goes back to this question about language. What do we mean by religious conservatism? And when politicians and media professionals use it, often they don't understand what they're talking about, or they do it in a way to deliberately distort and generalize and scaremonger, essentially. So when we talk about religious conservatism, what we're really talking about is adopting and adhering to kind of traditional understandings of Islam in often kind of literal ways which are kind of quite rigid and decontextualized to the way we live, or the realities of modern 21st century secular post-Christian Britain. So they will cling on to, for example, very, very old rulings when it comes to how Islam or the teachings of Islam kind of view public-private relationships, views on relationships with Muslims and non-Muslims, say, for example, views on punishments and so on. And we're talking about how the whole body of the Sharia is basically interpreted and practices. So they will talk about that in very kind of decontextualized ways. You can't just take the teachings or rulings from 500 years ago or 1,000 years ago or 1,400 years ago and implement them without any kind of modification or adaptation to the environment that we live in today. So when people talk about that in that way, it does look very conservative and it looks very rigid and it looks out of place. And then people get very uncomfortable, You see that in the way people talk about family values or the way they talk about, many other things in terms of, ritual and public practice of religion. And so they get labeled as being conservatives, So, for example, if you were to say Islamic teachings, mainstream Islamic teachings advocate that men grow beards or that women wear hijab in the public sphere, you run the risk of being labeled as a conservative Muslim. But actually, that's normative Islamic teaching. Do you know what I mean? So there is that kind of, it's a kind of easy kind of branding of anybody who wants to practice their faith seriously could be potentially be called a conservative. But what does that mean? It doesn't necessarily mean anything by itself.
No, you're right, because sadly, a lot of people seem to think that you are radicalized. Certain individuals will think you're radicalized if you pray 5 times a day, have a beard, or dress a particular way. So that is clearly, sadly, becoming a more commonly accepted thought process, which goes back to what you were saying. And I think it's a sad state of affairs, frankly, the situation that we're faced with today, the blight towards Muslims generally. We're not just talking Islamophobia, but from a political viewpoint as well. It doesn't seem to be getting any better. But if I can just kind of digress for a second, brother, before we continue down this avenue of discussion. You touched upon earlier about sort of global views of the work that you've done. I'm just curious to get an understanding of how opinions of your writings and your work and your lectures differ throughout the world. I mean, have you travelled and delivered your work, or has this mostly been a kind of UK-centric approach?
Yeah. So this book actually came out last year in hardback form, and it was at a reasonably high price, and so it was, and unfortunately I had nothing to do with that.
Right.
It was nearly £60, and so that at that time the publishers were targeting international libraries, essentially university libraries who could afford to pay for the book. And so I know the book has been purchased all over the world.
Right.
And I've had people who have written to me, and people who have actually written reviews from America, from Singapore, say, for example, or France and so on, different parts of the world, who said that actually, while this book is about Muslims in Britain, we think it's really interesting, very relevant, because we like to know what's happening in Britain, because British Muslims are very high profile on the global scene, so that's relevant to them.
Okay.
But also, given that the Sufi, Salafi, and Islamist paradigm exists everywhere else, it kind of speaks and resonates to their experiences, because they recognize those religious trends, but it's obviously played out in different ways in their own country. So for them, it's an interesting comparison.
Interesting. And have you gained any insights from people's feedback from around the world? I mean, has it made you think differently about some of the work that you've written?
Well, that's a good question. the thing is, I'm as a person who tries to study Islam on a global level, I it's kind of like my job to do that. So I haven't really had any surprises in that sense, because I do my best to try to follow as many different Muslim majority kind of current affairs as I can. And so it's interesting how Islamism is played out in different parts of the world, or different forms of Sufism, how are making a comeback, if you like. So, for example, there was a time when people thought Sufism was going to die a death in the UK because our traditional Sufi tariqas, the Chistiyas and the Naqshbandiyas and so on, Qadiriyas, the kinds of Sufi orders which many people from South Asian Muslim backgrounds will recognize, and perhaps people from Braillevi backgrounds can relate to this, that they felt, well, among second generation people thought, oh God, this is just, it's kind of embarrassing. We're not really interested in it. This whole thing about peers and kind of doing certain types of kind of religious ritual. It was just not relevant to living in Britain. And we, a lot of people from that kind of background, they thought, well, look, actually, it's not kind of Islam I can relate to at all, and it doesn't do anything for me. But one of my arguments in the book is that actually traditional forms of tasawwuf, Sufism, are actually making a comeback, and because they were kind of like reacting against the Salafi criticism of Sufism. So that happened at a local level here in the UK, but it's playing out now on an international level. Yeah. Where you've got Salafis who are constantly attacking Sufis and Sufism as being something outside of Islam. It's being a bid'ah in a religious innovation and so on. And Sufi scholars have kind of like challenged that on the basis of the Quran and Hadith and so on and so on. So you've got that kind of intellectual exchange taking place. Unfortunately, this subject is too relevant because people have taken that difference of opinion to a violent level and fought over these things. So you're seeing, it's been going on in Pakistan, in places like Afghanistan, and Iraq, and Syria, and that part of the world where, people have attacked Sufi Muslims. People who are more from the Salafi kind of camp, and it's really unfortunate. I mean, it's a kind of sectarianism which we really don't need. No. And it's based on ignorance and intolerance, and you're seeing the same kind of thing with Sunnis attacking Shias and the other way around as well. And it's really it's confusing it's confusing for Muslims, but can you imagine how non-Muslims view all this? They can't make head or tail of it. No. Yeah. So I think it's important for us, for Muslims to explain what is going on in our communities in an accurate way and a balanced way, and obviously to work towards bridging these religious divides.
Okay, a question I have is regarding the definitions of extremism. I mean, you hear that term bandied around quite a lot. And you always hear of extremists in various different groups. So, for example, even in Sufi groups, there are extremists, especially some of these things that we hear in Pakistan, for example. Yeah. I'm not talking just extremism in the religion, but also from a political point of view. There are Sufi groups getting involved in the political issues. How do you actually define extremism? Is it have you given it some sort of definition in your book, or?
It's a very interesting and important question. I have to be careful what I say, because the thing is, for me, with the whole extremism discourse, it's a bit of a minefield, both academically and within Muslim communities, because you see, there's no standard definition of extremism in the same way there's no standard definition of terrorism. No. So it is really on a common sense level as well. It's about who you speak to, really. So that the cliche that one man's freedom fight is another man's terrorism. It really is the case. But moving beyond that, I think there's certain agreed kind of parameters, but we can we can kind of can come to a common understanding. I think, and that is on the use of violence. Everything else is kind of subjective and based on your perspective. But when you start advocating violence, unnecessary, unqualified, random violence, and in many cases targeted violence, and particularly towards civilians, I think that really is the red line in how we would want to describe people's actions. Wanting to impose your particular view of the world on somebody else, that is extreme. Having an incredible amount of intolerance towards fellow Muslims and indeed non-Muslims, that is extreme, I think, by most people's reckoning. So I think there are those kind of common sense level definitions of extremism I think most people would agree on. Beyond that, I think it's an intellectual, ideological discussion and conversation, and people can differ. But I think everybody would agree that you can't go around killing people willy-nilly, and that is certainly not what the Islamic religion teaches. Violence in Islam is only as a last means, as a last resort, and it's regulated by the limits of the Sharia. So that's kind of like where we look to ultimately in terms of defining these matters. And I think most people know as well. There are well-known Islamic maxims around, prophetic maxims around, the Prophet peace upon him, warning us against extremism, and that Islam is the middle way. It's a balanced way. It is, you know what I mean? So
yeah.
I think it's not difficult to identify that.
Okay, Brother Jazakallah khair. It's been enlightening, insightful, and wonderful to have you on Friday Night Prime and talk to you. I'm glad we were able to organise it. Unfortunately, we are out of time. It's kind of flown by, which is the result of an engaging discussion, some would say. So I hope you've enjoyed that as well. And thank you again. Maybe we can have you on in the future to talk about some of your other books and their topics. I think that would be a relevant thing to do, Brother Faisal.
Yeah, sure. That'll be great. Thank you very much.
Jazakallah khair, and have a good weekend, and we'll speak soon, inshallah.
Thank you.
Okay.
Wa alaikum salam. That was Dr. Sadiq Hamid. Clearly a very accomplished and clearly an academic. I mean, very insightful in the work he's done. I mean, I haven't read any of his books, actually, I'll be honest, and I think I do need to read a few of his books now, having spoken to him, for sure. But brothers and sisters, I hope you've enjoyed that. We do try and get a variety on Friday Night Prime, from the sheet artists to comedians to academic scholars like Dr. Sadiq. So I hope that's kind of whet your appetite for more listening for Salaam Radio on Friday Night Prime next week, inshallah. We just have time to tell you about a few events coming up in the coming days and next week. So I'll do these in chronological order. So tomorrow is, well, essentially this is the event of the year, and if you haven't heard about it, you kind of not been on this planet, essentially. So this is To Know Him is to Love Him. This is tomorrow at the Gladstone Park Community Centre from 6 till 8 p.m. This is a free event. Food will also be served. This is open to brothers, sisters, families, Muslims, non-Muslims, no faith, whoever. So please do spread the message far and wide to come along. And this is a journey through the life of the most blessed Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. And we're going to be discussing, or rather the imams from Masjid Khadija and Fazana Medina and Dar es Salaam here in Peterborough, and Sheikh Imran Kathani from Libya, from Liverpool, will be also speaking, and we'll be covering the early life, character and making of a prophet, peace be upon him, his time in Makkah, his difficult journey, his exemplary character, Medina, making of a community, a shining star, and his prophetic legacy, its meaning and message. So this is a 2-hour educational experience, an opportunity of a lifetime to really attend, and it's just 2 hours just to attend with your family and absorb all that is Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, and then get to know him so we can love him even more, inshallah. So this is tomorrow 6 till 8 p.m. Please do bring your friends, neighbours, colleagues, whoever you might want to bring. Also Sunday is the annual Jalus taking place at Gausia Masjid, from Gausia Masjid, at 12:30, and Jalus will start
at Fazana Medina.
That's it, beg your pardon, yes. Starting at Fazana Medina, sorry. And it will end at Gausia Masjid. This is 1 p.m. The Julus will start 1 p.m. from Fazana Medina, and many guests from all over the country and all over the world will be taking part in that. That's an annual event which is always very well attended. So that's Sunday the 3rd. Julus will start 1 p.m. from Fazana Medina, and I just have time to tell you about an event, the 21st annual Mehfil in Naat. This is at Fazana Medina on Thursday the 7th of December after Isha Namaz, which is at 7:35 on the 7th of December, and this is separate seating for sisters, and food will also be served at the end. If you want more information, you can contact the organisers on 07916 316 712 or 079 51253 051. That's about all that we've got time for this week, unfortunately. Brother Faisal, as always, thank you so much for your company and support on these shows. It means a lot to have you with me every week. And inshallah, we'll be back with you same time, same place next week here on Salaam Radio at 9 p.m. with Ivan Humble and a special guest, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum.
Stay tuned to Salaam Radio.